Welcome to Old Path in our study through the Old Testament book of Isaiah. We get to the 23rd chapter today, and it ends a section that is referred to as the announcement or the pronouncing of judgments against the nations. And so we end with actually the city of Tyre in modern day Lebanon. Tyre is pointed out here in a neighboring city, though not by name, but they certainly would have had a lot of things in common, being Sidon. So there are a lot of times you'll find in Scripture where you'll hear Tyre and Sidon, they're neighboring cities, they're sister cities. Sidon being older, but Tyre being much more the port city. Very, very important to this particular era of history, especially as far as the kings are concerned, because of David and Solomon and the King Hiram. So we'll get to all that in due course here as we go through this particular study. Pretty fascinating stuff. I am going to do a little bit of a side-by-side of two actual prophecies against this city. One that really, I think, more deals with Assyria and what they will do to them, mainly because of really the rest of these judgments that we've looked at so far have been really mainly pointing out of what's going to happen because of Assyria. Now, the next major world power on the scene becomes Babylon. Chapters 24 through 27 deal more with what happens future at the hands of the Babylonians and more in the area to the south of what would be Tyre in modern day Israel. So we're going to get to that in due course as we go through it. A couple of things I want to point out, and they're somewhat related, kind of in the way of announcement. If you've been part of the channel for any length of time or going through the Bible studies, you'll know that I do apologetic things at the end of each of the sessions. And I'm going to do one today that I think is really, really important because it kind of helps put a lot of things into perspective or an understanding that's a little bit outside of what we're normally hearing. Now, if you know anything about me, you know I love taking groups to Israel. We have one that we plan to go on in April. The 20th of April is when we're supposed to depart. Needless to say, what's happening in that part of the world is really kind of putting a cramp, if you will, into what we want to do going there. But that shouldn't come as any surprise because of what I want to deal with on the apologetic topic, and that being Iran, and most importantly, what is it that makes them tick? What is their apocalyptic view of the world, and does that have anything to do with what's happening in the world right now? And the simple answer, of course, is yes. So I want to deal with that a little bit. What is their view of the end times, and why does it seem like that is such a driving motivation for them? So we'll get to that here at the end. And as far as our trip to Israel, we still have it planned. We want to go on April the 20th. Everything really depends on one very simple question. Is there going to be a ceasing of the hostility and, more importantly, the firing of weapons into Israel, which are really slowed down immensely right now? And in the last couple of days, the idea that this whole thing could be drawing to a close, and if that's the case and nothing is happening out of the north from Hezbollah or from Iran, then we have no reason not to go. And I'm very much hopeful that that's the case because this will be the perfect time to go. Most groups are canceling their trips, and so the demand is going to go way, way up. Starting next year. I know many of you have heard me say this, but by the fall of this year and all through next year, it's going to be incredibly busy. So I don't have any intention of going back until at earliest sometime in 2028, maybe the springtime. I will not put a trip together if there is more than normal interest and groups that are going. It's such a small country, and it's very difficult to get in and out of places of high demand, biblical sites, if there's a lot of people in the country. So I try to do our trips to avoid that. But weather is an issue, and when the spring feasts, when the fall feasts are happening, the holy days, and for Christians or Jews. And so we try to avoid all of that, not only for the expense, but because of the crowds. So honestly, we won't go there if I don't believe that it's safe. I don't want to jeopardize anybody's lives. And the companies that we use there, they won't let people into the country if it's not safe. And so all of that is taken into consideration. if you've ever thought of going and you want to go anytime in the near future, like within the next couple of years, this is a perfect time to go. Also, if you are not able to go, but you would love to be able to bless someone, we have a number of people who are sponsoring others to go. If you're unable to go, but you would like to help send somebody there who would otherwise not be able to go, I have a couple of people who very much would like to go, but financially they are really not able to. If you want to be able to bless them, if that's something that you could possibly do, I would put you in touch directly with our travel company. I don't want to be handling anybody's money. It's not about me taking any cut of it or any of that kind of stuff. I don't even want to handle it. But I will put you in touch with the company that we use, and make sure that you get a chance to see the person that you blessed in video. We take videos of the people who are there so that they can thank the people anonymously who blessed them. So we have a few that are already being sponsored there on this trip, but we have room for more if that's something that you want to do and you can't travel yourself. We would love to have you if you want to go. So that again is going to be happening in April the 20th, on April the 20th, if things continue in their current direction. So contact me through the ministry's website for the apologetic if you have questions on that, or the Bible study that we do today, or the trip to Israel, any of those things. oldpaththeology.net is the website address, and there's a contact us page there. So Isaiah 23, let's turn there if you haven't already. And we're going to have a word of prayer. And what I want to do is I want to answer a question that might be, asked if some people might have kind of a general understanding of what we see in the book of Ezekiel. And you can start thinking about where that is, chapter 26. We're going to go there here in just a moment as I put up an image. And I want to kind of answer the question up front if I could. So is what we're reading here in Isaiah 23 the same as we're reading in Ezekiel 26? And I want to be able to settle that. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll take a look at the text. Father, we thank you once again for the privilege that it is to sit at your feet. And we would ask, Lord, that you would help us in our understanding of reading your word and of making proper application for the things that we can certainly understand. So we thank you. We give to you all praise. We ask, Lord, that you would bless the time that we spend together and that it would glorify you. So we give you all praise and ask that you would help us as we read through these passages, Lord, that we would recognize that you are so incredibly accurate as you tell things before they take place, that we could have such confidence in you, seeing the beginnings from the end all at the same time. And so you can speak with that kind of authority and make to us known the things that we ought to know. So we thank you, we give you all praise, and ask again that you would be pleased with the study that we have here today, and we give you all praise in Jesus' name. All right. So there is a question that comes up when we start talking about Tyre. And as far as Tyre is concerned, the city itself, it's in the tribal allotment of Asher. So when the 12 tribes began to take land after the Exodus, the state of modern Lebanon was really part of the tribal allotment, and along the coast where Tyre and Sidon would be, that was under the control of the tribe of Asher, one of the sons of Jacob, and then of course the people who came down through that tribal line as they came into the promised land. So what we see as far as Joshua is concerned, when we read about that, during that time as they come in the conquest of the land, Tyre was seen as a fortified city at the time. So when we read here what we're reading in the book of Isaiah, remember, we're well into the line of the kings. This is after the time of the judges, and we go before that, and Tyre was a fortified city, as we read there at the time, in the tribal allotment of Asher. So it goes back a little bit of a ways. It's not something that by the time that we read this, that it's some kind of a newer city. Now remember also, by this time, as Isaiah writes this, we've already had the time where the temple has been built, the palaces have been built. So figure the times of David and the time of Solomon. they have already come and gone, and Tyre was instrumental in providing materials for the building of the temple. So when we look at the things of what was done through David, and then through ultimately Solomon, through the palaces, and then the ultimate temple, those were indispensable, not only for craftsmen and the people that were sent by Hiram, the king of Tyre, but also of the raw materials. So laborers and materials were provided by them. So Tyre has been able to see who the God of Israel is, and they have had involvement with it. And it's interesting that God singles them out for a particular kind of judgment. So then the question comes up, as I've already kind of brought up, what we're reading here, what's the parallel to what we see in Ezekiel chapter 26? So having your hand here on chapter 23, let's just read the opening verses of this. In Isaiah 23, we read this. This is the burden against Tyre. So where we've seen in some of these cases, it's been the entire nation. Here we're looking at the city, the prominent city of this area, of what is modern day Lebanon, what was in the tribal allotment of Asher. And so here Tyre is mentioned. Now it tells us, and so you think Phoenicians when you start to think about who's the nation and who are the people. So this is what is referred to as the Phoenicians. So it says, wail you ships of Tarshish, for it is laid waste, so that there is no house, no harbor, and from the land of Cyprus it is revealed to them. So this starts out by telling us who is in mind here. Not only that it's Tyre, but because of the people that start to be mentioned. And this is going to run through basically verse 8, and it's going to be God speaking about the fall of Tyre as though it's already happened, and yet it hasn't. And then he starts to describe what will be the reaction of the nations that surround them. And what some people have pointed out in this, kind of interesting, that Tyre was so thoroughly important to the commercial aspect of getting things through the Mediterranean and then inland. Some would say that it was so important that it's kind of like the coastal version of what would become Babylon, or those areas that are back out in the eastern side, the inland things. So very, very important to trade and all the rest. And that becomes evident by the reaction of the nations when they see its fall. So with that in mind, we're thinking about, again, contemporary to Isaiah. When will this take place? The Assyrians would come and plunder this, and depending on which historical accounts you'll read, this would either be done by Sargon or by Sennacherib, who followed him. Sennacherib would be the one who ultimately came to Jerusalem and was defeated. His army was defeated overnight by God and by one angel. That's that whole 185,000 that were killed as they slept, basically. So that would be kind of the Assyrian conquest of this, as they were kind of coming and taking territory. It's just what nations do as far as conquest is concerned. They would be followed by the Babylonians, who would ultimately be followed by the Greeks, and that's more what we're looking at as far as chapter 26 of Ezekiel. So we're going to turn there in just a moment. Let me do one last thing as we look through this. When we recognize what we see here, we will hear we're going to hear a description of Babylon, but not in the same sense that we get from Ezekiel. And let's remember that the separation time-wise, between Isaiah and Ezekiel is pretty immense. So as Isaiah's writing these things, there is really no Babylonian power at the time, though it's on the horizon. It will take over for the Assyrians, but everything with the contemporary history of Isaiah that he's speaking about is really dealing more with the Assyrians. By the time that Ezekiel's writing, think of all of what happens. You have, in the transition time with Isaiah, you have Hezekiah who comes. That would be the last king that Isaiah would have anything to do with. But after Hezekiah, you're going to have Manasseh. You're going to have Josiah. And then you're going to have the series of kings going through Jehoiakim when God cuts out the line. And then ultimately there's the conquest that happens by the Babylonians. In that captivity of those 70 years, that's when you start to have the writings of Ezekiel. So there's a great lapse of time, a massive lapse of time, well over 100 years from the time that Isaiah is writing these things before Nebuchadnezzar will come and do the things that he does, which is really what Ezekiel is dealing with. So having our hands here in Isaiah, let's take a real quick look over at Ezekiel, and we're going to chapter 26. So in Ezekiel 26, I want to pull up a map just because it'll kind of help us in our understanding of what we're looking at and why there's a real difference between these two prophecies, what we see in Isaiah versus Ezekiel. So let me bring up that map, and it'll be a little helpful to us as we understand the difference between these two. Now, what are we looking at here? As far as this picture is concerned, you're going to notice that there are some characteristic things. I've made a couple of little modifications in it. It looks like one land mass if you look at it very, very quickly, but this is not what it was all the time. So what you have in that white oval, you can see that they've built out to it. What that used to be, what you see to the left-hand side, was an island, and there was water in between. So what we know of, you can go back and look at the historical things. It's pretty obvious when you look at those two arrows that I have there. You can see where it's become more formal. They've built it out to it, but it was an island. It was separate. So what we're reading now in Ezekiel in chapter 26 deals with something that is future to Isaiah's time, and clearly by the time that Ezekiel's writing, a lot of world history has already taken place. And what has happened is that now Babylon has reconquered, if you will, all of the territories that used to belong to the Assyrians. So as the Assyrians go off of the world scene, on comes Babylon, and they start to do their same conquest and set up their governance and basically make all of these outlying provinces part of the empire, if you will, of what were the Babylonians. So they would conquer, they would be ultimately taken by the Persians. Ezekiel is writing during that time of the displacement of the people after the fall of Jerusalem at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, and then going forward. So here Ezekiel is writing about that very same thing, and you'll notice if you read through the whole thing, and we're not going to go through the whole of this particular book or of this particular chapter, but just kind of to give us an idea of what we're looking at in the picture itself. So if we look at if you look at verse 7, you see that God refers to and discusses Tyre and the interaction with Nebuchadnezzar. And so here, Tyre is being told that Nebuchadnezzar's coming, and it's going to be completely desolate, wiped out. Now, historically, we understand, just by reading the accounts of the third-party historians, when Babylon comes to town and does what they do, some of the people escape to what that picture is that you're looking at when it was an island, when there was water in between it. Now, it wouldn't have been a difficult thing if they wanted to. Babylon could have gone out to the island and wiped out the rest of it. It just wasn't worth it to them. The Babylonian Empire was massive, so a few people getting off of the coast to go out to this island and continue on, you had what was referred to as Old Tyre and New Tyre. So the people that escaped out to that island were ultimately kind of free, if you will, to some extent from what the Babylonians were doing. They weren't completely, totally conquered. So you understand that what we're reading here, if you look at verse 3, therefore, in 26 of Ezekiel, therefore, thus says the Lord, behold, I am against you, O Tyre, and I will cause many nations to come up against you, and as the sea causes its wave to come up. Now, of course, many nations really represented by the entirety of everything that was the Babylonian Empire. Many nations had been conquered by them. It's just a way of saying this overwhelming force. This sounds very different from what we're going to read in Isaiah. So it says, and they shall destroy the walls of Tyre and break down her towers. I will also scrape her dust from her and make her like the top of a rock. It will be a place for the spreading of nets in the midst of the sea. For all that I have spoken, says the Lord God, it shall become plunder for the nations. Also her daughter villages will which are in her fields shall be slain by the sword. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. So this description sounds tremendously different from what we are going to read in Isaiah. Now look further down in verse 12. They will plunder your riches, they will pillage your merchandise, they will break down your walls, and they will destroy your pleasant houses. They will lay your stones and your timber and your soil in the midst of the water, and I will put an end to the sound of your songs and the sound of your harps, and they shall be heard no more. I will make you like the top of a rock, and it will be the place for spreading of nets, and you shall never be rebuilt, for the Lord has spoken, for I have spoken, says the Lord. So what you get is an explanation of what you're actually seeing on the page there. Now, again, historically, we will know just by reading the third-party accounts of just what is basically world history. What happened is the accuracy of this is pretty astounding when you think about it, because the Babylonians end up, again, looking at this picture, they conquer all of the land that's on the right side of that photograph, which is modern-day Lebanon. That was the allotment. And there was a little bit of a body of water between that and what you see to the left side of the screen. And again, you can go back and look and see what the ancient maps of this, they just show that as being a little island that's right off of the coast. Not very big, but they were able to kind of fortify it. Now, again, Babylon didn't go after it. They didn't concern themselves with it. But history records that when the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Greeks, and Alexander the Great in particular, he was the one who ultimately did exactly as we read here, taking the ruins of the city and building a causeway out to it so as to conquer it. So what you're ultimately looking at here is a formalizing of what Alexander had done. In order to conquer it, he had to get his people out there to it. So they marched out on a causeway that they built, and they basically conquered the rest of the island. And what you see in modern times is just a building process of attaching what was the island to the mainland. And so having a way where you can get commercial things out there, that was just kind of what was ended up being done. So the accuracy of this, clearly at a much later date, remember again, the Assyrians are the ones being spoken of as we go back and study through Isaiah. They would give way to the Babylonians. The Babylonians would give way to the Persians then to the Greeks. So the Persians are really not even figured here. As you read what you're reading here in Ezekiel, it is saying to us that this is going to be, what Ezekiel's talking about here, will begin at the hands of the Babylonians through Nebuchadnezzar, and at a later time, considerably later, Alexander the Great will come around, and he'll finish off the things that you see here in verse 12, and that shows us what we have in modern times of the connecting of one body of one land mass to another. Now it looks just like a permanent port. And it's not. It was not that way initially. So I will pull that down, and let's go ahead and take a look at Isaiah 23. Okay, so as we look at this particular passage in Isaiah, let's turn back there if you haven't already. And there is something that's asked and answered. It's kind of rhetorical, and it's actually found in verses 8 and 9. Let's go ahead and read those real quick, because we'll go back to what's being said here in verses 1 to 7. What we read in verse 8, it says, "Who has taken counsel against Tyre, the crowning city, whose merchants are princes, whose traders are the honorable among the earth," or of the earth, the Lord of hosts. So it's a rhetorical question in verse 8. It's answered in verse 9. The Lord of hosts has purposed it. For what reason? Well, it's to bring to dishonor the pride and glory of all glory, and to bring into contempt all the honorable of the earth. Now, again, it's really the sacking of Tyre would not only be a problem for the people who are there, but also for the nations that are lamenting what's taking place here. So the people that are making themselves rich over the whole commercial part of this is really who's in mind here. Now, they're the ones that are described for us in the first 7 verses. And then it'll go on afterwards when we get to verse 10. it'll start to say a little bit more about what's going to be the reaction to the fall of Tyre and what's going to come of the people, and then what does God have as far as the final plans for it. But what I wanted, why I'm doing it this way, I wanted to make sure that we understand that here is a nation that shouldn't have looked to itself as being anything more than what it was. It isn't as though they didn't know who God was in ways that are a little bit different from even some of the other surrounding territories. If you think about like the Philistines, they're a great example. Theirs was not politically favorable necessarily to Israel, and they were oftentimes an adversary. In the case of Tyre, wasn't so much the case, especially during the kings. There was a friendship between David and even through Solomon and the king of Tyre, being Hiram, and whoever else was involved in the political side of what was Tyre. So they would understand that it was a house for the God of Israel. They would understand who David was. They would see that God's hand was upon him, same with Solomon. You can go back and read all of that. There's quite a bit of history between the first two kings, or the second and the third kings of Israel and this nation. So would God hold them accountable maybe a little bit different than some of the other surrounding nations because of the kind of relationship that they would have with the kings, the favor that they might find, and then being able to be kind of a third party witness of what God had done among the nation of Israel? Yeah, I think that there's definitely a case that could be made for that, because we know that God holds people accountable for what they know. And here is a case where of the surrounding nations, they would certainly understand. And you can read the things that Hiram would have said, and recognizing the favor that God had given them. So we read this in chapter 23 of Isaiah. So it's the burden against Tyre. And then it says, "Wail, you ships of Tarshish, for it is laid waste," that being Tyre, "so that there is no house, no harbor. From the land of Cyprus it is revealed to them." So even as far as the neighboring closest real full island being Cyprus, they're affected as well. Now Tarshish here that's being mentioned, there's a lot of discussion of where exactly is Tarshish. It's referred to in Ezekiel in his prophecy 38 and 39 of the people that are of Tarshish. And there are quite a number of different possibilities that are proposed by people. Pretty much we're thinking about what would be kind of Western Europe, and some would say it's in the British Isles. Others would say it's kind of in a different place, more to the south and more in the mainland of Europe. But anyway, however people might want to try to describe where it is, it's intended to say it's kind of like the farthest reaches, if you will, of what is the known world at the time to the west. And so this is really kind of more, what Isaiah is trying to do here, and the Lord speaking through him, is to attach to this what's going to happen to Tyre. It's going to affect basically the known world at the time that would have commercial dealings with them as far as a coastal city is concerned. The stuff to the east is not as much necessarily the point, because that's the stuff that starts to go more as it goes inland. We're dealing with Tyre as the port city and the nations that would be interacting with it as a port city. That's really kind of more why we're looking at the ones that are mentioned here. So it says, "Be still, you inhabitants of the coastlands, you merchants of Sidon," which is a little bit, just about 5 miles to the north. The older of the two cities, but the ports of Tyre were really what made them who they were. So it's kind of like modern day, if you look in Israel, go down the coast a little bit, the main port, or the main attraction, if you will, on the west coast of Israel is Tel Aviv. Yet below it is what is the ancient port city of Joppa, and that was the main place to the south of what would be here Tyre. If you're looking for the equivalent on the coast, you go down a little bit further, and Joppa was this main port that was there, but it doesn't have necessarily the recognition. In this case, it's kind of reversed. Sidon is the older of the two cities, but the port that got all the attention was here, Tyre. Down the coast a bit in modern day Israel, it's kind of in reverse. The old city that was very, very important commercially is Joppa, but what gets all the recognition is modern day Tel Aviv. That's the big jewel, if you will, along the west coast. And there are a few cities of real prominence there, but Tel Aviv, modern day, is really the jewel of it. So we look back at verse 2. You be still, you inhabitants of the coastland, and that's pretty much Sidon is mentioned here, but the people who would dwell on the coast of what is that modern day, what's considered Lebanon, and what was the tribal allotment during the time. Remember, by the time that Hiram's come along, the nations are kind of in a bit of a different situation, if you will, because during the time of the judges and everything else, the tribal allotments kind of really saw a bit more of a breakdown, because you would have not any longer really being seen as the tribe of Asher, though David is a king of the 12 tribes, and 13 if you want to call it that, because of the Levites, but he's the king of the nation. And so this would have been Asher's tribal allotment, but there's a king that's not Jewish at the time, and that's, this port city is really kind of its own country, within its own country. So he says this: you merchants of Sidon, whom those who cross the sea have filled, and O great waters, the grain of Sihor, which is more than likely looking at, as far as Egypt is concerned, the harvest of the river, more than likely looking at the Nile itself. So would that be a major trade partner bringing things up out of northern Africa? Of course. That's, obviously Egypt was a big deal at the time. So it says, and she is a marketplace for the nations, being Tyre. So if we don't really fully know who all is intended here, really the surrounding nations are just thrown out there as a recognition of all the people who are dependent for commerce with Tyre, and yet God is calling a judgment upon them. Now, why he singles them out, great question, and I've already thrown out the only, to me, what is probably the most credible of all of them. Why are they so singled out? But, of course, if for no other reason, because they really did have a better understanding, probably than any of the other surrounding nations that were not Jewish, of who is really the God of Israel. So Tyre would have that designation as well as any. So we read in verse 4, be ashamed, O Sidon, for the sea has spoken, the strength of the sea, saying, I do not labor nor bring forth children, neither do I rear young men nor bring up virgins. The idea of the day-to-day of things, it's as though the sea has swallowed up. And so the imagery that's here best seems to fit the idea that when God brings this judgment upon them, it will be as though they've been consumed. And the sea is being used more as a metaphor of the way that Assyria comes sweeping in. Because again, what we know happens at the hands of the Babylonians, the next world empire, that's what Ezekiel's dealing with, and it sounds a whole lot different. Here, this is really kind of the nations and their reaction to what happens as the sea kind of just gobbles up, in the picture, the metaphor here, all of the surrounding people who are dependent to some extent on this commercial port are all left wondering what's taken place here. And so God sees to it that using the Assyrians come in, and they are the hand of judgment, as he's referred to them already. Now again, they're there for a time. God uses them the way that he does, but he ends up dealing with them as well. What ends up bringing down the Assyrians, we will know, happens at the next king, with Isaiah being, assuming that Isaiah is writing this during the time of Ahaz, the next person that would be coming would be Isaiah. And so if Isaiah is in mind here, not Isaiah, Hezekiah rather, Hezekiah would be the person at the time when Assyria finally comes to try to finish off Jerusalem. He's the king at the time. He and Isaiah come before the Lord, and the Lord delivers them and really kind of puts a real, almost a fatal blow to Assyria, though they're there for a while after, until Babylon takes them out and really kind of just more absorbs them. They become the world power. So all of that's just part of world history, easy to track down. So Verse 5 says, when the report reaches Egypt, they also will be in agony at the report of Tyre. Cross over to Tarshish. This is God saying to the people of Tyre, when this all happens, you may think that you can go as far as you want to. Cross over to Tarshish. Just God saying, go ahead, leave, do whatever you want to do. But it says, wail, you inhabitants of the coastland. Is this not your joyous city, or is this your joyous city, whose antiquity is from ancient days, whose feet carried her far off to dwell? So some people look at that far off to dwell as maybe meaning something different, like that means that there is the idea that God's going to scatter them and that their feet are going to carry them to some place of safety. Look at the context of this. This is kind of more him saying that you've had this luxurious life, and yet he's saying now that it's been plundered, he's speaking about it, it's still future, but he's speaking about it as though it's a historical event that's already passed. So he's speaking about it with such certainty that he would say to the inhabitants, remember, he's already talked about here's what the reaction is going to be of the surrounding nations as they see what's happened to you. Here he ends up saying to the people of that, when this all takes place, look at your beautiful city. It goes back and it's ancient, and yet look at it. It's completely plundered. Is this your joys? Is this the city that you had so much joy over that's been around forever? And now look at it. This is the city that has provided for you the ability to go far and wide because of its riches and all the rest. And now it's been brought to a place of plunder. So really that's kind of verses 1 through 7 is really this way of God saying, here's what's going to happen to you, Tyre. And it's going to happen at the hands of the Assyrians. We know that historically because this is being spoken of differently than what's going to happen in Ezekiel's time. So, two different events, same city, different circumstances. As we've seen, the details, the internals of the judgment in Ezekiel as opposed to Isaiah are really very different. So let's just kind of make sure we understand that we're talking about two events here. So what we get in verses 1 to 7 is really ultimately how the nations are going to be affected because Tyre is going to be taken apart, and its freedom as an independent port city that really takes care of the whole part of the world, getting things back to the east, is now going to become just a province and an outpost of Assyria, and it's going to have to be, as always, the conquered things end up having quite a bit of damage done to them. Now again, remember, as we see in Joshua 19, where Tyre is mentioned, I think I have the verse here, it's 19, verse 29. Joshua refers to it, or the book of Joshua refers to this tribal allotment of Asher. There are a number of places. It just is kind of telling you the boundaries, if you will, of the tribal allotment that was given to Asher. And then in that section at verse 29, Tyre is mentioned as being this fortified city. So goes back quite a ways. By that time, remember, think about how far back that is in the history from Isaiah's time, that even at that time it was considered a fortified city. So with all of everything that it's had to this point, God looks at it as being completely a wreck, and the nations are going to have their reaction, and then God's going to say, this thing that you put so much stock in, you inhabitants of it, now look at it. So here's the question. It's rhetorical. We read it already. So then the question is, so who has taken this counsel against Tyre, the crowning city? So who's doing all of this? That would be the question. Is not only who's doing it, but why is going to be answered as well. So this is a way of looking back on verses 1 to 7. So who's actually bringing all of this to pass? God is saying this is going to take place. Is it really just the Assyrians and their desire for conquest? Well, sure, yeah, absolutely. Every world power wants conquest. But here, ultimately, we see the power that drives behind it, making it possible, is that God is judging them. Assyria is only the tool that God is using, but it's ultimately God who does this. Now look at what he says. This city, and he says, whose merchants live as though they're princes. It just says the merchants princes. Even R is added in there, but it's for flow. But it says, whose merchants are princes, or they live as though they are princes, whose traders are the honorable of the earth. So he asks the question, this one that should have every ability to maintain itself and the idea of its strength and its power and all the rest of it, who is it that could take counsel or come up with an idea that this could happen. So that's the question. Now look in verse 8 where it talks about the counsel that is there. It's the same word that we read in verse 9. The Lord of hosts has purposed it. Now, it's the same word in the Hebrew, counsel of verse 8 and the purpose in verse 9. So it's an answer to the question. Who is it that has put this plan together? It's God who has planned it. That's the simple answer. So again, this is the Lord speaking through Isaiah, asking and answering the question in a rhetorical sense. But here's why he's decided to do it. The reason that he has decided to do it, why he has proposed it, why he has counseled to bring it to pass, that's the big question. It said it is to bring dishonor to pride and of all glory, and to bring contempt on all of the honorable of the earth. That's the judgment. These people who have this grand assessment of themselves. So when you look at the actual words themselves, it says it is to bring dishonor. And the dishonor is just it's basically for the people that would look at themselves, as we see the pride of all glory. It's pride is that saying, it's that self-assessment. And God will show contempt for that, and he'll show dishonor to it. So a person who will elevate themselves in their own eyes, God will bring them low. So it's really a way of saying everything that man will make of himself, God will produce in them something that is the complete opposite, because they will be incredibly humble. Second part of this, it says to bring contempt on the honorable. And so the honorable are the people who elevate themselves and make themselves weighty. They're important. They're impressive. They have a great deal of ability. And God says here, I'll make light of them. So these people who esteem themselves so incredibly high, God will make them kind of contemptible or light, little, almost in the sense of mockery. So again, this is telling us a bit that we just don't really fully understand. Why is God doing all of this? Well, because they had entrusted in everything that had made them who they are. And he's already discussed that in a bit in the verses 1 to 7 by the reaction of the people of the surrounding nations who looked at it as so very, very important, and then their own self-assessment. This is a humbling that God does in the extreme by conquering them. So in verse 9, to bring to contempt all the honorable of the earth, not just there, but all the others. This will have such an incredible resounding effect when it all takes place. So again, we don't know why. What provoked it so much? Is it because they should have known better because of their interactions going back through the line of the kings to David and Solomon? Should this be a time when the nation should have humbled itself? But let's face it, there's nobody who kept it together for any real length of time throughout the history when God started to work among men. They might get it together for a while, but it only lasted for a while. Think about even when we're talking about Assyria and what happened with Nineveh. God was ready to judge Nineveh, he basically sends Jonah, who doesn't want to go, preaches to them, doesn't care about them, hopes God will wipe them out, and they end up repenting, and it lasts for a while. But then, again, the same Assyrians of Nineveh are the ones that God will ultimately use and then exalt themselves, and God will have to humble them at the hands of, at the time, rather, of Hezekiah and Isaiah. So this is just kind of the flow of mankind. God will do something among them, they'll recognize it, but ultimately they will become very much infatuated with themselves and convinced that they are the ones who really govern what happens going forward. Well, as we read in verse 10, overflow through your land like the river, O daughters of Tarshish, and that's just a way of saying everybody that can be mentioned. Tarshish, again, being this unnamed place, but this is kind of God saying it's time for you to flee. Get out there, all of you people who think that you're of, these worldly people who are so influential. And God says, like what happens when a river overflows its banks and it goes wherever it wants to. This is basically God saying, the Assyrians are coming, so overflow your banks and go. It says, O daughter of Tarshish, there is no strength. You're going to flee thinking that somehow you are going to escape, but the plunder is complete. You who used to have a lot of strength, or in your own mind you did, look at how fast it can be taken away from you. Now, the application, of course, to anyone reading this would be able to say that idea of self-assessment or thinking somehow that we are ultimately in control, look at how fast that can be taken away. And we have examples of that in the kingdoms of mankind. Since this time going forward, oftentimes people think so much of themselves, but it can happen in a moment that they are absolutely humbled. So this is one of those cases, of course. So it says, verse 11, he stretched out his hand over the sea, and he shook the kingdoms. The Lord has given a command against Canaan. Now, some people look at this and say, Canaan, why is Canaan being mentioned here? There are some that would say because Canaan being a geographical area and because there would be so much dependence on this port city and all the rest. Well, or it may very simply be this. This is now speaking about the advancement of the Assyrians as they move through the land. Canaan would be a place that they hit first, and they would be moving towards the coast. So remember, as you're thinking about it, Assyria is way over here, and Tyre's on the coast of the Mediterranean. As Assyria sweeps across, Canaan is caught up in the whole thing. So by the time Assyria does all of it, they're going to be going so far down into the south and over by the time that they get into areas even south of Lachish is mentioned. You're talking about getting into much of the territory of what is all of Israel and all of the tribes. So Assyria is going to wash over the whole area. So it says, he shook kingdoms. The Lord has given a command against Canaan to destroy its strongholds, which of course would have happened at the hands of the Assyrians. They sweep from east to west and they conquer everything in between. This is just basically God saying, by the time that they get to you, they will have already got everybody else. And we know that that's the case. Historically, we get all of that. That's told to us through the Kings and through the Chronicles. We know what takes place, and some of this is going to be covered in Isaiah as we go forward. So it says in verse 12, and he said, you will rejoice no more, O you oppressed virgin daughter of Zion. That's this way. A virgin is not oppressed. Unless, of course, they are being conquered, what they saw as their own purity, their own virginity, if you will, speaking in metaphor, you're going to be oppressed. So virgins, again, not oppressed, but until such time as all of their purity is now being conquered and taken from them. That's the picture that's supposed to be, here for us. Arise, cross over to Cyprus. There also you will have no rest. The Assyrians can get to you there as well. You might think that you can escape, but ultimately you cannot. Behold, the land of the Chaldeans, this people which was not, Assyrians founded it for the wild beast of the desert. They set up its towers, they raised up its palaces, and they brought it to ruin. So what would be ultimately the capital going forward, the Chaldeans, speaking about what would become the Babylonians, it's part of that empire of the Assyrians, and they built up these places and all the rest of it. So it's just a way of saying what never used to be now is being raised up, and what will come out of that Assyrian empire will become the Babylonians. It's a place that they built up. It's God basically saying, here's what Assyria will do, and the ones that will come from after them. So, verse 14, wail you ships of Tarshish, for your strength is laid waste. So again, if Tarshish is being spoken of here as just emblematic of the reach and the wealth and the breadth of the commerce of Tyre, that's what's being used here. It's just a way of speaking of Tyre in the way of being so global, all the way to the ends of the earth. And so he refers to them as Tarshish, though he's speaking of Tyre. So this is the judgment against Tyre. He's not talking about the other nations other than their involvement with, commercially, what is Tyre. But his whole prophecy and what will become of them is against that one particular city and the surrounding areas, the coastlands. And it's going to happen at the hands of the Assyrians. So all of the world commercially is going to be affected by this one fallen city. It's pretty amazing when you stop to think of it. Now, it says in verse 15, and it will come to pass in that day that Tyre will be forgotten 70 years, according to the days of one king. Now, some people would say this is speaking metaphorically. Well, there are times when God will be very, very specific. The time of the Babylonian captivity of Israel, of Judah in particular, when Nebuchadnezzar comes, that was 70 years, literal 70 years. Now, why? Well, God tells us that by putting together what we have at the end of 2 Chronicles. The last chapter tells us that God has 1 year of captivity for every cycle of 7 years that they didn't give the land rest. They did that for 70 cycles, 490 years. They had not done as God said. Cultivate the land for 6 years. On the 7th year, give it rest. So there was a reason why God would make sure it would still provide for them, though you didn't have to cultivate it. It gives the land rest. It's a way of pointing to Sabbath. There's a number of reasons why God said to do it. Agriculturally, it's a great idea. But there's a lot of reasons why God said to do it, but it was really something that God was very specific about, and they ignored that. And they did so for every 7th year for a series of 70 cycles. And finally, God said, well, you've provoked me to the point you're going to go away into your captivity, but how long will I make it for? I'll make it for your disobedience to me telling you to give the land rest, and you've done it for 70 cycles. So you're going to go away for 70 years. And what happened at the end of that 70 years? Zerubbabel through Cyrus goes back. So you have that as a history. Here, that's why I would believe it's literally a 70 years. Now, let me stop before we go any further, and let's recognize something that's really, really important. We have a lot of detail on the 70 years of the Babylonian captivity because it really is very focused on the people of Israel and Judah in particular, what God does of taking them away in their captivity and bringing them back. God concentrates a lot of information and a lot of attention on those times and what happens when they come back. We don't get that same thing here, but I do believe also this is intended to be literal as we read this. So how long is the plundering of what happens to Tyre at the hands of the Assyrians? How long does it last? Well, it would give the impression that some things begin to change as they come back. So it tells us this. According to the days of a king, 70 years. At the end of 70 years, it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the harlot. Now, this is, again, one of those things. What is the song of the harlot? Where does it come from? What's its origins? Is it really something that's just here for the first time, or was it something that they already knew? Was it some kind of a folk song type of a thing? But here it's recorded, and God said it's like that song. And again, if it's something that's kind of in their own antiquity, it makes sense. So it says, take the harp, go about the city, you forgotten harlot. That's the idea that everybody's not paying attention to her. So she sings this song, make sweet melody, sing many songs that you may be remembered. It's just a way of using a cultural idiom that they would understand, a song that was there, as though it was a harlot. Nobody remembered until she goes out in the street and begins to sing, and now people start to pay attention to her. So again, used as a metaphor here. You're going to be, that part is, the literal part is you're going to be plundered. At the end of 70 years, using something that would be understandable to them, they'll start to be recognized again. So this is God's way of saying you'll come back to a place somewhat of prominence and people will start to take notice of you again at the end of 70 years. So we read on. It tells us, and it will be at the end of 70 years that the Lord will deal with Tyre, and she will return to her hire and commit fornication with the kingdoms of the world on the face of the earth. So she'll get back to what is the normal course of things. So at 70 years, there's going to be, as the Assyrians kind of go off of the scene and they're not paying that much attention to it, seemingly, she'll be able to rise back to some level of prominence again. And yet because we've already read what happens to her at the end of what happens with the Babylonians, we do know this, that she's never rebuilt to the same way. She never comes back to that place of prominence by the Babylonians. We've already read it. It's a place where you'll basically spread your nets. Now, current modern day Tyre, you can still go visit it. They say the residency there is about 60,000 people. well, in a country of millions, 60,000 is not all that impressive. It was the focal point of that entire country at one point in time. It's certainly not that now. So does that mean that it has to be completely uninhabited, or the place that it's where fishermen just spread out their nets, relatively speaking to what it was? That's what we have in current modern day Tyre. But compared to what it was in its heyday, at its pinnacle, it's almost it's basically, you can't even hardly see it by comparison. That's the point. So as we read this, now notice what we have here. Her gain and her pay will be set apart for the Lord. It will not rather be treasured nor laid up. Its treasures will not be laid up for her. Gain will be for those who dwell before the Lord. So whatever it is that she might be able to amass, it's ultimately going to be for the Lord to do with what he will, and to eat sufficiently, and for clothing. So ultimately, when God allows us to come back to place, it's still going to be in service to him, whether they realize it or not. And some people point to this and say, well, however that was, we just don't have record of what it would ultimately be. And this really does seem to be speaking about what happens before the Babylonians come, because it gets completely wiped out. But we do know that even by the time after all of that takes place. So let's think about Tyre, what happens here. The Assyrians wipe it out, and it really lays dormant for about 70 years, and it comes back to a place somewhat of prominence. Going forward, what ends up happening? At a later time, the Babylonians come, and it's conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, though not completely, as we read in Ezekiel. That really didn't happen until the Greeks come around. So by the time that the Greeks come around, that causeway is built, and that image that I had put up a little bit earlier helps you to understand modern day Tyre has formalized what was done by the Greeks. They made a way that you could get out to that island just off the coast. But really, at that point, the Greeks give way to the Romans. So by the time that Jesus goes there, which we do know that he went there at one point, and there's only a reason that you would go there, because there are people who understand what it's about. So he goes there at one point. But more importantly, there was a Christian church that Paul ends up visiting. We get that in the book of Acts. Was it 26, I think? In fact, I think I may have written that down. Did I write it down? I didn't. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's Acts 21. Jesus goes there in Matthew 15, verse 21. Paul is there in the book of Acts, chapter 21, verse 3. So, again, that doesn't mean that Tyre is completely wiped out, but it never regains its place of prominence, and that's ultimately what ends up happening in two stages. First, at the hands of the Assyrians that Isaiah deals with, ultimately by the Babylonians, into the Greeks that Ezekiel deals with. And the two writers, Isaiah and Ezekiel, are more than 100 years separated from one another as far as the events are concerned. So interesting stuff. And again, I don't know about you, but I do very much love the history of things. And let's remember the one thing about all of this. We can go and look at all the historical stuff, which is most all of it. It is only when you get to verses 8 and 9 that we get to the place in this entire chapter of these 18 verses. What does it mean to me as I read these things? Well, it's good for us to understand the history and why God does what he does. It's verses 8 and 9 that ultimately helps us to understand, why is this all being done? Who is it that has put this whole plan into motion? It's the Lord that did it. And why? Well, because he wants to take those people who have elevated themselves in their own minds among the people, not giving glory to God. They've made themselves something that God never thinks of them. They make themselves of their own self-importance, and God is not impressed with it. So it's God who brings them from their own self-exaltation. He brings them to humiliation. So there is a really good lesson to be learned, if you will, an application to us here and now. The idea of making ourselves more than we are ultimately in God's eyes. There should be a real humility that God's not impressed with any of us. And anything that we could possibly do in any way that is of any usefulness would be him as the author of it anyway. So good reminder, good application for us. The next few chapters, chapters 23 to 27, are going to deal with some some very, very heavy things that will happen more to the south, more looking at the Babylonian things, and we'll kind of intro that next week as we go through it, and starting at chapter 24 through 27. So I want to take a look at something that I think much of the church really doesn't fully grasp when it comes to who Iran is and why some of the things that are taking place are actually taking place. So let me address it this way. When it comes to Iran and the involvement that we have here, and the idea that it's a nation, why are we going to war? You have a lot of people in the church that are kind of losing their mind about it, and all the rest. And why is this happening again? Well, I don't want to get into as much the politics aspect of it, and it doesn't look as though this president has any idea of going into the country as we did with Iran or with Afghanistan. He was very much against those kinds of wars where you're going in with occupying forces and you're setting it up for lengths of time. What we see that's happened with Venezuela, what he wants to do with Iran, from everything that we've been able to see, is we'll take out all the upper leadership, get rid of them, and what we'll do is find people that will be more comfortable in its dealings with just the kind of the civilized world, and if not, we can come back. So that seems to be more the way that we're doing this. It's why you don't see a real push to put a bunch of people into the country to take it over. Trump spoke against that stuff vocally when it was happening with Iran and with Afghanistan, and it doesn't seem to be at all in his makeup. But here's the thing that I don't think most people understand, and this is why it's so important for us to recognize what's really going on in that part of the world, and what it is that's taking place on Iran's point. So the world is reacting to something that they probably don't even know why they're reacting to it. Why is it that Iran is doing the things that it's doing? Why is it different than the rest of the world, and what its ambitions are? Now, in order to answer that question, we have to know a little bit more about who they are. There is an article that I'm going to put in the notes to this video that help you to get a little bit of an understanding of what I'm talking about, but it's something that a lot of people don't really fully recognize. Within Islam, there are two main houses. And there is what we call, you've probably heard the terms, the Shia and the Sunni. And so the Sunni is the much larger of the two groups. About 85% of the world's Muslim population is Sunni. The Shiites account for basically that other 15%, and the people who run Iran are a sect within Sunni Islam. Now, the break in the houses is after the death of Muhammad. You had some who followed one of his strong men, a guy named Abu Bakr, and that is where the Sunnis, they line up behind him. The other ones line up behind his son-in-law, a guy named Ali. And so that explains who the Shias are. The Shiites, the Shia of Islam, are the ones who control Iran. And so what you start to ask yourself the question, okay, great. What do they believe? Now, let's remember that whether you're a Sunni or Shiite, Osama was a Sunni. So it's not just that the Shiites are the crazy people and the Sunnis are the ones that want to get along with everyone. They don't. Any real genuine adherent to Islam, whether they are Sunni or Shiite, realize that theirs is a call to conquest. That's what the Quran asks for, conquest. It's to subdue the earth. In the Sunni side, or I'm sorry, the Shiite side of things, especially when it comes to those who rule Iran, starting with the Ayatollah Khomeini at the time of the revolution in '79, this was a whole different world as far as these guys are concerned. So, as a Christian, if you were to ask me, do I have a view of the end times and of eschatology? Clearly I do. And so anybody who knows me at all, or the fact that we approach the Bible as we do, that every chapter, every verse of the Bible is to be taught, we're going to run into prophetic things where God speaks about this at detail and at length. What is it about now? What is it about future times? Is there a Messiah involved with our view? Is there an end of days? All of those kind of things. Absolutely there is. So We don't have a problem explaining that. Jesus is the Messiah. He lived among us, and he will come back as the reigning King of Kings and Lord of Lords. There's a lot that we could say about our eschatology, or our view of the end times. And so, is there an apocalyptic view of things? Yeah, the book of Revelation, we call the Revelation is the English word, but it is in the Greek the apocalypsis. So the apocalypsis of Jesus Christ, the revelation, it's a revealing of things. So when you read the book of Revelation, it's the book of apocalypsis in the Greek. So the idea that God wraps up everything as far as mankind is concerned, starting at chapter 6, that describes what is future to our time, the view of Old Path and of Calvary Chapels, is that starting at chapter 6, that's all future stuff. So John starts to see the beginnings of that stuff in chapter 4, but the actual rolling out of the apocalypsis and the actual judgments that happen on the earth begin at chapter 6. So that is our eschatology. That's our view of the end times. We see it as being something that will be in the world's future, actually some would believe not too far from now. So the question would be, within Islam, are there similar beliefs? Is there an end of days? And how is that going to take place? So in this article that I'll put up there, you'll see some things that I want to make an observation at the end of it. So in the leadership that you see in modern day Iran, the problem that we have with them, and most people don't realize it, is that they have an apocalyptic view of the end of days, the world, the end of the world. And they have a part in that. What are they supposed to do? So within the theology, the belief of this sect within Shia Islam is that there are this succession of imams throughout history, and they're these people that have been raised up by Allah to be the leader of the nations, or of the nation rather, and of Islam. So they believe that there is this one that is going to be revealed, a very messianic kind of a figure. They refer to him as the Mahdi. And again, there's a lot to be read about this, but I don't want to spend a great deal of time going into their eschatology. You can read it. There's a lot in this article, and you can do a ton of other study on the whole thing. Why I don't want to really spend a great deal of time talking about that is because of the observation that I make at the end of it. So, within Shia Islam, and in particular Iran, the view is that in order for that last Imam, the Mahdi, to be revealed on the earth, it happens at a time where there's enormous corruption. So within Islam, the way to avoid corruption is to be very devout towards the belief and the tenets of Islam. So it's very radicalized. It is intended to be a way of conquest, and that when the Mahdi comes back, he's going to put down all of the corruption and everything that takes place. So their Messiah figure needs to be revealed when all of this is taking place. They see their holy lands as needing to be purged of all of those who are not believers. Israel is a great example of that, and it's inside of what they see as their land. So it needs to be purged. So that helps to explain a lot of why they spend so much resource of having proxies. In this case, Hamas and Hezbollah are really very much dependent on Iran. That's where they get their funding. That's where so much of it comes through. So the idea that they would want to cleanse the land of not only the Jews, but of anybody that's non-Islamic, that's one of their things. They have to do it. The corruption that they see, they don't even realize the spiritual side of this. It's really the devil behind the scenes wanting to once again make the Jews the focus of his rage and his anger and his hatred, because God has singled out Israel for being the one that he loves. Yes, he loves the church, he loves mankind, absolutely, but he made a covenant with Israel that's different than any other covenant that he's ever made through the ages, because it was with a people and it was with a land, not the church. The church is from all over the place, and it is a spiritual covenant that he's made with us. It doesn't deal with land. It doesn't deal with a specific DNA line. So you can be of his body, the church. You can be the redeemed of mankind from all over the place. But the covenant that he made with Abraham to the land and the people is unique to them. So that hatred that the devil has for those people is different than he's had for any other group ever in the history of mankind. So the idea that you have an apocalyptic cult like what you have in Shia Islam that rules Iran, if they think that somehow the revealing of the Mahdi can't really happen until there's a purging of the land, then they're pretty highly motivated to do the things that they do. Pursuing all of the things of weaponry, even up to nuclear things, it's all part of their deal because it really ultimately triggers the return of their Mahdi, their messianic figure. So really, when you start to think of it like that, reading the article, reading everything that you can read on it, here's the simple takeaway that we should all have to this. They believe that they can bring about their end of days kind of a scenario by their actions of ridding the world of those who are not believers as they are. So if that's the case, and I'll just put it out here to you this way if you're a believer, if I could tell you, and I could make the case from our writings or from the beliefs, and let's remember, the Quran is written as it's written, but there are the hadiths, which are the traditions that are handed down. It's kind of the Jewish people have the Talmud, and those are the commentaries, if you will, through the ages. Well, the hadiths serve kind of the same way within Islam. In Christianity, we don't have all that stuff. We have what the Bible tells us, and we walk accordingly. Now, some churches put themselves in the place of saying, well, we've had these additions, I'm thinking mainly of the Orthodox and the Catholic, but they will say, well, from time God has spoken through us, the agents that he will speak through, and we have these additions that are supposed to be on par with the original writings of Scripture. A Bible-believing Christian doesn't look at a church as having that kind of authority. But you will find that within Judaism through the Talmud and writings like that, after the fact writings. And you so also have in Islam, because the Quran is not written like the Bible. If you've never read it, you basically will have much, much, much more commentary through the ages and a lot of additions that the Quran allows for. So much of what you see in the world around us is because somebody in a place of very high prominence, religiously speaking, has added their 2 cents into what they see there. They're open to that ability to add to what's being said and issue all kinds of edicts. So here we are. This 15% of what is Islam being Shia, and this sect within this little branch of Islam, the Shia, are the ones who control all of Iran. And they believe that their actions of purging the world of the infidel and all of the corruption and the rejection of their form of Islam needs to be conquered. Of course they're going to begin their revolution. They're going to begin amassing the ability to subdue the earth as they see it, and that will all be assisted when the Mahdi comes. And they believe that they're the ones who will make sure that that takes place. So again, I ask this question as we look at it through their eyes. If I was to say to any really dedicated believer right here, right now, listening to what I'm saying, if I could convince you through our text that there was something that you could do that would bring back Jesus tomorrow, how motivated are you to do that thing? Now, again, the church is never asked to do something violent. The church doesn't have anything that we can point to in the text that says, if we do this, we'll bring back the second coming of Jesus or the rapture of the church or whatever it may be. There's nothing in the text that would make us believe that. We're told to occupy until he comes, and we don't know when that will be. We're just to be busy about his work here on this earth, and if tomorrow comes, tomorrow comes. We're not going to hasten it by a day or by an hour or by a minute. It's all known to him. That is not the view of the people who are in Iran, and that helps to understand not only their hatred and animus towards us and towards Israel, because they see us as the corrupting influence in a lot of ways, and the basic way to get rid of that corrupting influence is to destroy them. So the idea that since 79 they've been saying death to America and death to Israel shouldn't surprise anybody. It's not just hyperbolic, it is they literally mean that. In order to reveal their Messiah figure, these people, these evil people like the United States and Israel, who are the ones pummeling them right now, are the focus of their hatred more so than any other nations. So interesting. It helps to put things a little bit into perspective if we understand the eschatology and the apocalyptic view of this sect within Islam we know as the the Islamic Iranian revolution that took place in 79 and continues to this day. They're the reason why this whole war is taking place. They're the reason that October the 7th happened in Israel. They're the reason why Gaza is just a dirt pile right now and that much of Beirut is being hammered. It's because of the tentacles, if you will, of the Iranian revolution that has set up shop in Lebanon and in Gaza. And that's why those things are taking place. Now, I am sure that I'm going to get a ton of people chiming in on this that are going to have all kinds of crazy things to say about dispensationalism and Darby and Schofield and all the rest of this stuff. But they don't really stop to see that Israel is the focus of hatred that the world has never leveled at another nation like it. And what we have in the place of Iran right now is, again, it's apocalyptic stuff. And it's because Iran really sees it as their place in world history since they've taken over a regional power like Iran and have turned it into a theocracy. If you don't understand what that means, governed by God. So all of the leadership, every political decision, every military decision, every decision for the entire country is made by the religious fanatics at the top and has been for the last almost 50 years. We need to understand that as far as the world history is concerned, because it helps us to understand why are things happening as they're happening. We are reacting, and I think our president, and maybe to a lesser extent, I think some in Israel absolutely do understand the religious the belief religiously that there is in Iran. I don't think that our country really realizes that we just see them as a regional threat that needs to get put down. We've just found out in the last couple of days that their ability to fire off their rockets and things like that is able to get to areas much more than anybody, well, much more than people were willing to admit. And they went after one of our places, Diego Garcia, which is way beyond the reach that most people realize that they had as far as their capabilities. And if you have that, it puts all of Europe in there. And if, again, you have the ability to reach those kinds of places with nukes, people start to take you serious. So all these things involved, all these things taken into consideration really kind of helps us to understand a little bit more about what's taking place there. And it's really prompted by Iran's desire for expansion and countries that realize what that ultimately means. I don't know that the surrounding countries really understand the spiritual dynamic behind it. And it's understanding that really helps us to put pieces into place and why things are happening the way that they are. So again, read the article. It's pretty interesting. It gives you kind of a breakdown, and there's lots more that can be read about it. But we need to realize that what we see in Iran is a group of people who are as committed in their understanding of their end times as I would be of mine. Understand that. So I am absolutely convinced that the next big event as far as the church is concerned is Jesus returning for the church, and thereafter you will have what is shown to us in the book of Revelation of God's judgment upon the earth. We believe that, or I believe that, as really kind of the chronological series of events. Just realize this, the people that are in control of Iran have their own version of that, a perversion of it, but they're just as dedicated to that as I am. They actually think that they can do something to precipitate it and make it happen, where I say, no, it's up to God. He'll do it when he's ready to do it. Different thing entirely. The God of Islam is not the God of the Bible. Never could you make that case based on their writings versus what's in the Bible. Contrary to what some people would say, the God of the Quran is very, very different characteristically from the God of the Bible. They are not the same, and people need to recognize that. It will help you understand a lot more about what's taking place in the world. Questions on any of that? Contact me through the ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net, and I look forward to picking up with you in the book of Isaiah next week as we get to chapter 24. I hope you're able to join us.